thank you very much for the invitation and the opportunity to talk to all of you about our work here. And yeah, thanks for showing up and your interest in this. And yeah, I mean, saying a bit about myself before I go into this, I have started with the project 3 years ago, when beforehand, I have to be honest, I didn't know anything about values. So to me, this was an adventure. And I can say a bit more with whom we worked on this. But certainly I've read a lot of papers of researchers present here. So it's based on your work, most of it, mostly, and that we try to translate. I'm working for the Joint Research Center of the European Commission. I'm not sure if anyone ever heard of us, because it's not that well known, especially in the social sciences world. But I think it's going to be more important in the future. And we are part of the European Commission, and we are the science advisory service of the Commission. So basically, if policymakers in the Commission have any question on something, very often they turn to us and ask us, okay, what is this? Can you tell us what we should know about this? How is this interesting and important for our policies that we're designing? Can you give us more guidance? So that's basically the role of the JRC, and we're spread across Europe in different sites. And I mean, I'm in Brussels, but we also have sites in Karlsruhe in Germany, in Sevilla in Spain, in Patton, and in some other locations. I actually don't know all of the locations, but we are basically spread across the globe. But our main seat is in Ispra, Italy. So we have our interdisciplinary and intercultural experience every day in the Commission in that sense. But yeah, so my unit specifically works on trying to get science into policymaking more. So I said this in a very idealized version. Policymakers ask us about a lot of things we do and a lot of science, but very often we know we produce science, but the uptake of it may be perceived to be limited. And I think many scientists share this perspective of they should just listen to us more. And we are exactly working on the conceptual work. How could this go better in the future? And yeah, one of these strands is this Enlightenment 2.0 research that Plamen talks about, where we do research and summarize research on what else other than facts matters to people. Because this idealized view of that many scientists have, because as a scientist we work that way of, there's new information, there's new evidence, we should just update our beliefs now and act accordingly. That usually is not how humans work, as I'm sure many of you know, but still it's our model of scientists, like, yeah, here's this evidence, why is this not taken into account? And there are many other reasons, obviously. And yeah, we're trying to map them out and then think about how can we then design processes in the policymaking process to improve the uptake of science. So that's the overall what we do. Also small task, and by no means would I say we have solved this, but that's how I get at this. And now I'm going to share my presentation and tell you where values fit into this picture. So yeah. You should see the presentation now. It's on applying value science and policymaking, insights from a large interdisciplinary collaboration in the European Commission. And yeah, I certainly haven't worked alone on this. I give you some names with whom we collaborated here, but it's basically the summary of the science up to the state of the art at the point when we wrote the report. And yeah, I already mentioned, to us, the starting point was, well, we have this tension at the moment in society, where we seem to see democracy under duress, in trouble. Plamen mentioned it. We have the war going on, but that's only the latest out of many developments we've seen in recent years, where it's not only that we see direct attacks on democracy, but also indirectly within democracies. We've seen this challenging both of scientific evidence, but also decision-making processes where people are fighting what we are delivering, and there's people who argue there's a truth decay. And so to us, the question was, okay, how can this be? We have ever more evidence available, we have ever more knowledge available, and we seem to be, at least in our understanding on the values, going in the right direction. What's going on here? And that's where we reach out to a lot of scientists with an open call asking, so what is that really drives people in their political core? And yeah, an important response to this was, well, yeah, certainly values as something that we should think about in this context. And it's not only the science that tells us this, but it's also if you read the news, the daily news, and I give you here a snapshot of the things that are potentially relevant to us, you see values mentioned very often. And so you might think, well, they're important, okay? But what you also see is that they're very often mentioned in contexts of group conflicts. So where one group talks about another group and then criticizes another group. And the second observation is that very often it's both sides of the conflict who mention that they are standing up for the values, whatever the values are, and criticizing the other side on either having bad values or being bad altogether. So this should, of course, make us think. And I know you have, you devote your life on your research on this study of values. But for many policymakers, I think this is a surprise in terms of, yeah, but everyone says there's in favor of values, but well, is this then just empty talk, or what's going on here? So that's how we enter into this research scene. Now, the evidence behind, before then I go into the project itself, of course, we've seen in recent decades this move of a conflict line from the old politics, which was around economic conflicts, who gets what, into the new politics of an added conflict line, at least one on freedom, LGBT rights, gender rights, but also ethnical issues, religious issues that have complicated the picture dramatically for policymakers. So for them nowadays, if they propose a policy, earlier they could just say, okay, who gets what out of this in terms of monetary terms? But nowadays it's really much more complicated. If you propose something, it can get criticized from many different angles. That makes it so hard and so difficult to think about this. And of course, we know the evidence behind this. I think you have seen this graph many times by now, this rise of the cultural political issue relative to the economic issue, where by now we would say, yeah, well, we don't know if it has overtaken it or it's more important, but it's certainly as important as economic issues. But at the same time, there's another interesting paper came out 2 years ago or 3 years ago already, in the first version by Gethin et al., Piketty, one of the other co-authors, where they looked at who is voting for what over time. And they also collected for several democracies some social demographics, and then voting for left or right. And what you see here is that they present that who has voted on these parties over time has changed, especially based on education. And so from in early times after the Second World War, basically those with a high level of education, that's what you see here, the highest 10% education achievement, voted more right-wing and even compared to income, but it has dramatically shifted over time. And now, yeah, education is correlated with a voting more for the left parties in our society. So we cannot really show causality here, but so with this shift of the cultural dimension, we also see a shift of who votes for certain parties. And certainly we should think, you as scientists, me as scientist, where are we? Well, we are probably in the top 10% of education achievement, at least by the definition used in the study. So let's think where we are on this scale. So yeah, I'm presenting the findings of the reports, part of the Enlightenment 2.0 research, especially the values and identities research. We had previous reports on understanding object nature, where we did more of a broader overview on the landscapes of also emotion, trust, groupthink, and all of these things that matter for how the uptake of evidence happens. But yeah, that was that part. And technology democracy, which went into more how did everything that changed in terms of technology in recent decades change us and how we make decisions in democracies. Then here, values and identities. And finally, the next project we're working on will be meaningful and ethical communications, specifically from governments or governing organizations. But for this project, we work with lots of experts, and that's the methodology that we want to work with, or in general do work on. It's that we put out a call for experts like you, who are then working in the field, and have this tremendous insights already into decades-long research, but from multiple perspectives. Because usually a policymaker doesn't want to know, just one dimension. So what do sociologists think about this? What do psychologists think about this? Or economists? They want to know, what does the science say about this? Now, as you can imagine, that's not easy. The science doesn't exist, and we disagree on many smaller detail issues already. So we reach out to experts to then make sense of all of these dimensions through their expertise. And I give you here the list of names for the report. You probably know some of them who work directly with us. I made some bold that I thought you know better, but really from all kinds of disciplines. Pippa was on board, Frederick, Luc, but also others, so that really get as holistic a view as possible. Now, I mentioned in the title of the discussion here was already learning from this and on the policymaking perspective. So I want to give you a little bit of insights into what that means, because that's usually not the part that many scientists engage in, but where we are, let's say in the trenches, we are at the front line, knowing how this is going on. Here you see an image of the State of the Union address of President von der Leyen last week, State of the European Union, I should say, importantly. So whenever we give scientific advice, it can be taken from many different angles. And here's just one way how to describe this from a relatively old book, actually already. And just to give you some idea of your scientific advice will always land within a different context. One is, for example, if this policymaking process is seen as knowledge-driven, that means where policies are treated as a research process. That's probably the most, that's what scientists usually would think of. Yeah, we need to just uncover the reasons and then we do it, which is that we need to uncover it. Second one would be problem solving, where the scientific evidence that's already there is applied to an existing problem and then said, okay, we know what works here, so we apply basically what we already discovered in decades before. Another one is where it's interactive, so you present the scientific research and inform policymakers, but it's only one part of the process, because usually policymakers, they're not only looking for scientists, of course, what they tell, but they're also looking into all kinds of stakeholders in society. What do they think? What do they want out of the process? And therefore, yes, this is just one of the inputs, and it informs them into, what do they need to do. Another one that's then going into the dimensions that usually scientists do not like so much, that is the political and tactical. So political one is where basically policymakers already know what they want and just looking for the studies that confirm this. This would be then the policy-driven evidence making, as some colleagues term this, which also happens. It's not, it varies to degrees. Sometimes policies are like that, sometimes not at all. It really depends on who is the policymaker, what is the circumstances, and so on. Another one is the tactical one, where it's not necessarily that policymakers already know what they want, but they use evidence, for example, the publication of a big report to drive forward discussions in certain directions. And that's where some of your studies may fall in. So if you have a new interesting study that you present, for example, I talked to Plamen it's already months ago, I think, on a study on the values of Ukrainians relative to Russians, that if that then is published, that itself will drive the discourse to a certain degree. And that's something that we need to be aware of. It doesn't mean that you shouldn't publish it. It doesn't mean that you should. It just means that you can be sure that this will move the needle to some degree in one or another direction. So just as a glimpse of these are the different ways of how your science may enter, and usually it's all of them to some degree or another. So it's never just one. So for us, then thinking, so how do we do this? How do we think? How do we work with evidence on values? And our approach is, well, we look at the policymaking cycle. That usually, I mean, many of you know about the EU institutions, but perhaps the policymaking cycle is less known, and it never exists in abstraction. That means almost no policy really follows exactly that logic, but it's a good stylized version of thinking through policies. Why do I make the point of this? Well, what we wanted to do was really give advice on policy making and not on policies. The important difference being that what we used the evidence for was we wanted to inform each and every policy that's being developed, that they should think about values dimensions for each policy that's being developed, rather than saying, okay, you need to do this education policy or you need to do this economic policy. We said, no, whenever you do a policy, think about what this means in terms of values. And so, for example, taking here the work program of the Commission for this year, so you really know what the hell we are doing the whole, I mean, not me personally, of course, but policymakers in the Commission do the whole time. Here's some examples. So propose a regulatory framework for certification of carbon removals, follow up on zero pollution action plans, adopt the European Chips Act, which, chips for production of computers and so on. Recommendation on minimum income to support policies in the member states, or reach swift agreement on remaining legislative proposals under the new Pact for Migration and Asylum. So you see, there's lots of different areas we work on. Each of them has a values component, but the question is, where and how should they then think about values? Do you have specific research that works on this? On some, yes. So on migration, we have lots of values research. On others, European Chips Act, not so much. Zero pollution action plan, yeah, some. So we needed to think about a process of how to bring a values consideration in, even if there are no studies yet, because some of these policies are new and forward-looking. That brings us to, why is this so difficult? Because of the myside bias. I'm sure you heard about this in one term or another, for example, confirmation bias. But an important finding that we have in the literature in psychology, well established, is that people's own values and also the views of people around them that they identify themselves with automatically color their beliefs of facts themselves. So it's not only that we have discussions about values, we have discussions about the facts that are very often proxy fights for the actual underlying values discussions, because we know values are diverse, and I mean, research shows this, but that means that people then think that they are completely correct and right and argue about the evidence, whereas actually they would probably be better if they would argue about the values behind this. And the myside bias is shown to be not mitigated by intelligence or political sophistication. So no matter if you're a scientist or a policymaker who thinks about themselves, usually we think we're intelligent. We're still subject to this bias. We're still subject to we want evidence to be true if it's in line with our values, and that's unconscious usually. So that's a very big issue for evidence-informed policymaking. And so we thought, well, we cannot just discuss values in the abstract of values are very important. That sentence we hear a lot, but we actually need to give people an understanding, something to work through whenever they think about values. And that's in the next steps that we did, that we created an infographic on this and some processes to go there. I think this slide here, I usually have it in for policymakers to convince people that values are important. I think you would agree with me already, so I'm going to skip most of this. But yeah, the biggest important point that I always stress, but where I've seen in recent discussions on even Plamen's show, I call it Plamen's invitations to scientists, is that very often we find as evidence that more diverse, that values are more diverse within than between countries. I think we have Ronald here, if I may say. I mean, these are the papers that I cited heavily in the report. We've seen recent discussions around this, whether this is actually true or not, but still there is diversity. That's I think the important point that we make usually on the EU level, that each member state needs to think about this. So values are important, but how are they important? And here we went into the baseline, the Schwartz values theory. Now, I discussed this already, and I think this is where Plamen reached out to me. Well, but what about the social values between countries? And we discussed this obviously a lot within the research group. What is the right way to focus on this? But what we felt was particularly interesting about this approach, besides the fact that it's empirically very robust, was that it's also very pedagogical, because it prescribes an understanding of the values already. We may argue whether this is always the right way to do. Is this empirically robust enough? If you do factor analysis, do these factors always come out, and all of these things? But the great thing about this is that you don't need to tell people something about, I did some factor analysis, and then this is the factor that has loading of this and this and this attitude, which no policymaker usually understands because they don't have time, not because they're not smart enough. But the Schwartz values give you some definition for each of the values, and you can use that then to make an explicit understanding of a policy initiative, like, okay, look through this dimension, look through this dimension, and that's very useful. We've seen. Another important point where I think there's still more research needed is this move from personal values, which would be in the Schwartz terminology, but also you can say them the underlying core values. If you do this is factor analysis, and then the other approach to political identities and to political values, if you want to call it that way. I think there's multiple dimensions there, because an important point usually that we have here that we're facing when we're discussing about this is, how do we get from knowing what people want in abstract to getting people to want this politically, so voting for this, also convincing them that this policy responds to their underlying what they want. And that's not easy, and we should be aware of that difficulty. I think this graph then we had an underlying Eurobarometer as well that went into the field with this project, where we asked agreement with EU values. So EU values here is defined based on, we use the Charter of EU Fundamental Rights and termed some attitude questions towards this. They were all framed in a positive way because we wanted to make them in line with the Charter. And then we also asked Schwartz personal values. And then, here you see the multidimensional scaling exercise of where does this then fit. And we saw this ran in the COVID pandemic. So we had not the perfect value circle, I would say, according to that criteria, where we had a lot of self-direction merged with universalism items. But EU values went right there. And I think that's usually the values as we talk about them here. So how much do you agree with freedom of thought, freedom of religion, things like that. So liberal values in that sense. So that was the one side, values. I also make a very, very short detour to identities, because very often you have research that looks at either one of those. What we've seen in recent years, and that's we've been advised by researchers that we talk to, that values is one important thing. But if you think, for example, in the US, on this polarization that's going on there, the argument is that it's not so often the underlying values, but very often identity nowadays. So are you a Republican or a Democrat? has become more important, also more predictive empirically, when you look at all kinds of, I mean, pretty much everything. I mean, not only political issues that have been raised at the moment on abortion, migration, or economic policies, but even things we've talked to other scientists there on what should we do about mental health of children. Even there, the one variable that picks up everything is, are you Republican or Democrat? And so identity is extremely important there, and we've looked into studies comparable in Europe. And at least in some countries where partisanship is also very important, but also other identities are relevant. So that's why we also say we should never look at values in isolation. Values are kind of the playground for identities as well, where we delineate each other, as I showed in the very beginning, even in the media. And what do we see there? Well, identification with a group is human nature. Everyone does it to a certain degree, but identity is also always multiple. So, you know, it's our national identity, our gender identity, our sports identity. We can switch very quickly between those. And that's a problem, especially in democracies, when it leads to out-group biases and discrimination. And even if it's really strongly emotionally laden, we saw the evidence that then people are willing to say, you know, democracy, I don't care, as long as my group beats the other. So we see this on democracy side, Democrat side, Republican side a lot. People are just willing to say, I don't care about the democratic rules as long as my group wins, my party wins. And that's then a danger for democracy. The identification with the group still reflects citizens' values. Both in tendency, but also in importance of the group. So people who are scoring high on values on conservation, so caring about traditions, security, conformity, they care more about the group perspective, which may then even lead them to adopt attitudes that are usually not in line with their underlying values orientation. But also, of course, we can build groups around specific attitudes. So feminist identities, parental identities, and so on can also lead us to identify with the group. And we just gave based on one paper, a systematizing of identities that are relevant to policymakers. One is then based on locality, nation, EU identity, European identity. Another one on organizational identity. So are you Republican or Democrat, for example, in the US, extremely important. The demographic one, gender, ethnicity, age, but also, interestingly, something to take into account here, sectoral ones. So if you work in the department for research, like I do, you have different norms that are relevant to you than if you work in the department that works on environmental policies, or a department that works on growth policies. Very important, different mindsets there. So that's the science and the process how to get there. I would propose potentially to do a short stop here. So if you have questions on that, before I then present all the tools we propose how to deal with that in the policymaking process. So in this policy cycle that I mentioned, if you go from identification of a policy issue to what policy could we do to the implementation, we have a number of tools like Foresight and media monitoring that we'll talk about. Now, as I mentioned, it's nice to know all about this value and value diversity, and we have this infographic, which is nice, and people like it and hang it in their office. But it doesn't mean that anyone will seriously think about this, because it's hard to think through other values angles. It's really hard to do that, and we've experienced now doing that. So what we proposed in the last part of the report, and this is arguably a bit more shaky, where I would encourage, if you want to do more research, feel free to do your own stuff, of course. Feel free to reach out to us, because we are doing some of this right now. We proposed a set of tools. One is about basically understanding yourself and understanding citizens more broadly. One is on then designing policies either in a co-creation mode. And the last one is then, have you done step 1 and 2, and you decided on certain policies, how do you communicate properly? And just give a very, very quick overview of this, each of the tools, but of course you could discuss each of the tools for hours as well. So one thing is it's this value self-assessment. So what we did was we designed websites. It's still, due to data protection, not published, but it's available if you want to test it. I can send you the link. I'm certainly happy to do that. Where then you can answer, the typical Schwartz values battery, and then we took from the I think the ESS was it, where you have the representative evidence on the values, and we map your values and spiderweb diagram against that, and then also to show you, these are the values that you prioritize above the EU average, and these are the ones where you're not doing that so much. So there you might have blind spots. Give some further explanation towards this. And I'm currently designing a study how to evaluate this, whether it actually does anything with a person who does it. So will they be more open afterwards to that? A second one is rapid assessments. This is for, I showed you a list of policies that we work on, and that's the usual thing in the commission, where then someone who does not know anything about values can do a very quick checkup on, is my policy issue an issue where I think there could be a lot of values and identities issues underlying. And I see as an example on this, which we clearly state at the beginning, this is not a problem per se, right? I mean, an issue around values may even be very good. You should do probably something that's people are in favor and that they think a lot about in terms of values, but it might give you some evidence to think, there might be some conflict here, some polarization going on. And if you have that, if you have a high score, then you should think better about the process of how you arrive at a policy. So the important insight here is people do not only have preferences towards policy outcomes, but they also have preferences towards how is a policy, how do we arrive at a policy. So in other words, there are many papers that show people are much more okay with a certain outcome if they feel that they had a voice throughout the process. If they had given their vote and they see, well, others want something else, then they are kind of okay with it. Whereas if something is imposed on them and they feel that's the whole populism argument by elites who don't know me and want something else, then they're much more opposed to this. So here, if you have a policy that's sensitive, then you should probably do more some things like citizen engagement, deliberative democracy, tools, and so on, which I will come to. Another one we argue a lot about, that's basically what you do very often, is, well, whenever you do a survey that's asking for specific attitudes, let's say, what should be the optimal level of air pollution in our country or in our cities? That's a very abstract question. And then relating this to underlying values and morals, no matter how you define them, could be quite enlightening and to understand, how do people see this? How do they understand this will allow them to do what? And the underlying theory here is, of course, the what Jonathan Haidt, but also the literature on moralization says, is that people sometimes don't know why they feel certain things. They don't know why they have certain attitudes. They have some moral intuitions that may then drive later on perspectives and attitudes. And by this, you could uncover this. So that's the these are the just learning ex ante about policies and citizens' perspectives. Going to tool 2, there's lots of research on citizen engagement already, but usually that's a little bit separated from the values research. So we have colleagues who work now for 25 years on really doing citizen engagement well, and it ranges all the way from the lowest level you can do, which is focus groups, all the way to citizen assemblies, where you actually empower citizens to take decisions on behalf of certain aspects that you want. So like deliberative budgeting in cities, which we have at the moment, and so on. So the question is, how do you get from this abstract value idea, which needs to be instantiated, if you argue through the Schwartz values lens, but also through other lenses, to specific outcome that is fit for purpose in the specific local context that people want. So yeah, citizen engagement, lots of research to be done to bring values diversity into this, I think. But yeah, we help on how to do this. Another interesting thing that we have started is our values workshops. We have done several already with colleagues on policy initiatives, where basically we do a half day, and we let people, we let policymakers come with their policy issue. So saying, you know, we need to do something around migration, or we need to do something around cybersecurity, and then we first teach them about all the different values, let them explore them, and then we let them do role play of thinking, okay, if I were a person who really cares a lot about security, or if I am a person who really cares a lot about tradition, how do I see this issue? Is it even a problem? What do I want out of this? And so on. And then you get basically out a table later on, or a graph of all the different values related issues that may or may not conflict, and trying to find common ground there is much easier if you have spelled it out. So going back to Henrik's comment, this trying to find the common ground here is a task, while being aware of there are legitimate other perspectives. Another and the last co-creation part is on Foresight. So Foresight is becoming more and more important, and I think I exchanged views with Greg on this, that also in the European Commission we want to, you know, be future-proof, as you called it, and that involves thinking about what scenarios you want to have of the future in the medium to long term that we can work towards. And here, understanding values and values diversity really well is, well, very important. And at this very moment, we are discussing with the colleagues who are working on this Foresight exercises in the European Commission of how can we, well, increase the understanding and of values in the process, so that we can understand scenarios through different perspectives, and then therefore make it more applicable. So that's the co-creation process. And the final parts, and here I wrote this also, you see Vladimir is with us. So hey, Vladimir, who helps us with this work, where we design a media monitoring tool. So the JRC does gather European, so basically actually globally, news media for a long time now. So we have 15 years of data, web scraping every 5 minutes, all kinds of news sources globally. And I think it's 200,000 articles per day that we gather. And the question was then, okay, how do they talk about certain values? And one approach that we have done based on the paper that Vladimir and colleagues have published is that they build a dictionary that we can then run through each article and say, well, this article talks a lot about this and this value. And you see here an example that we've done where we can then, on vaccines, and we can then look at, you know, what are the top values related words that we talk about? How does this compare to the average news reporting? How does this compare over time? And also, how do countries differ in this respect? And from this, learning about values diversity, even in the news media, which is important because then people learn from the news how things is relevant for them in their daily life and what they should support if given their values. And so this is quite interesting. And I will come back to this because we have another project on, we want to build a machine learning algorithm to improve this work further, where we need help. And the very last point is what we were testing at this very moment in a bigger study is communicating using values frames. So if we take this serious that people care about certain values, but they have different values, then there's an argument made mostly on the moral foundations theory that you should communicate within the values priority of a person to be more persuasive. And we do this for 3 different policy areas: environment policy, migration, and economic policies. And we basically design values messages from all the 4 quadrants of the value circle, and see and measure people's values priorities as well in advance, and then see, are we more persuasive or not? Is it actually working? But also the second part, which very often I feel scientists don't do so much, at least I haven't read so much in the papers about it, is do citizens even think this is okay for us to do? right? I mean, at least we as the Commission or as the EU, we are a democratic institution. And if citizens say, well, you shouldn't do this, then we shouldn't do this. So we also asked them afterwards if that's okay that we did this. So in conclusion, yeah, policymaking itself as a process is multidimensional. You saw multiple things that work at the same time, all the way from migration to carbon taxes to smaller issues. That it's not linear. It's not a simple process. It goes from problem to solution, but it's really back and forth. Values, similarly, as you well know, are multidimensional. Abstract, but also important for people's attitudes, perceptions, political behavior, beliefs, everything. So bringing that together is not easy, and it's still a challenge that is underexplored. We think we've done some work here that's based on your work with you together, but happy to continue this journey. And some of the tools we propose, they are appreciated by policymakers. So we have worked with some of them already who use them and say, well, it has shaped their way to think about it, but it's still extremely hard, because even if you know, okay, so these are the different values perspectives, what do I do about this then? You know, because in the end, we need to come up with a policy that is implemented, and that's not always easy. And yeah, just keep it in mind, we don't change someone's mind just by giving one presentation or workshop or tool. This is a continuous journey to do, and more applications and adaptations is needed. But yeah, your research helps. So I'm basically the messenger here both ways. I'm telling policymakers that they should take up your research and think about this. But on the other hand, yeah, I'm also telling you it's relevant, what you do, and we could probably do a bit more, but I think it's super important that we do it and that you continue doing your research. So I stop here. Thank you very much.